Okay. Hi. Welcome to Two Clinicians versus the Patriarchy, where we ponder how many clinicians it takes to tackle the issues of society. As you know, I'm your host, Claudia Lechner. And on this show, I shall be engaging in discussion with a special guest who also works in the field of psychology, so that two clinicians will come together from different experiences and different identities to share their conceptualizations and their critiques of gender as lived in 2022. And so each segment will feature two aspects, a bit of a reading to inspire us and get us started, one you hopefully check out in your free time, and a conversation with a guest about a topic related to their own life and experience. And today I'm joined with our third special guest, Sandra Bautista, a licensed clinical social worker who has worked in the county for many years, maybe over 20 to 30 years. Currently, she works in the court system via her court linkage program, assessing and placing individuals in custody and treatment. And I have had the pleasure of knowing her not only as a mentor, but actually as my mother. So Sandra, I'm so excited to have you today. I know mom is definitely going to slip out in a few times. I wanted you to introduce yourself, if that's okay.
I have to tell you, it is such a pleasure to do this with you. Well, I have to say why. It's so nice to see you as a colleague. I've always depended so much on your razor sharp clinical skills, but this is just really an honor.
Thank you
for having me. Thank you so much. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I have been in the field of mental health for about 30 years, which reflects how old I am. And I have worked mostly with the chronically mentally ill, with adults and children. And at this point, I'm working for Department of Mental Health, and I work with a program known as Court Linkage, and I work with mentally ill folks who are facing criminal charges in the courthouse, and I advocate and help out in treatment for them.
Yeah, it's an amazing work that you've done, that I've gotten to witness too, that I grew up with, and definitely inspired me in some ways to take on this field. I think you know that. So the reading I have for us to talk about, as you know, we're going to be discussing microaggressions today and the changing times of feminism, of psychology. Mm-hmm. And the reading I had for us is Mazzula and Nadal, 2015. It's called Racial Microaggressions, Whiteness, and Feminist Therapy. And I think this will touch on something we always discuss for many hours, especially as therapists who are people of color, who are Latinx, and who tend to give therapy to people in Spanish. And so I guess as a Latinx person, I'm curious about your experience giving therapy to our fellow Latinos and how so much can be lost in translation, right? Because most of my caseload happens to be in Spanish with mm-hmm. clients who are not fluent in English. And I noticed how certain cultural phenomena could be completely judged or pathologized. Mm-hmm. Unless someone was very culturally aware, but being in the culture, I think of things like family closeness, which are often pathologized as enmeshment. Mm-hmm. Cultural norms like machismo and familismo, which are values that I think they're difficult for our clients to manage. They matter to them, and they're very overlooked by other clinicians. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I wanted first, what do you make of this? What's your experience?
I think I was always quite aware of my Latino clients. I think I understood early on that I was alone in the field in some ways. And because I had this philosophical belief that at the end of the day, humans are humans and we all endure somewhat the same developmental milestones, I always sort of rely on that. And I think part of my work as a clinician through the years that I've been doing this has been educating others that sometimes what we see is part of a bigger landscape in terms of culture, that sometimes pathology is a term that is loosely used by the dominant culture, and that you must understand the minutia, the somewhat the cultural points of reference before making such a sweeping judgment in terms of pathology. So I think I was a voice in the desert for many, many years until because I've been in the field for so long that the idea of cultural diversity, of understanding cultural differences, the dialogue, the narrative that you see now did not exist when I started practicing. So it's come a long way. By no means it's we are where we're supposed to be, but I think the dialogue has begun, and in that sense, I'm very optimistic. Look at you. I mean, I think your cohort and folks like you who are going to be the newcomers to the field come with so much more desire to explore that which was left behind closed doors in the past.
Yeah, and I think something you said too about how sometimes the dominant culture sets the scene for what the norms are, or the values are in the culture. So there can be this assumption of white core values. And I'm thinking of, you know, the assumptions of individualism or independence, that sometimes when I'm working with Latinos, for example, there are some things that are assumed that might not really translate well. And how that can in some ways be damaging, and maybe it was in the past much more, and now there's kind of this wave coming forward of how do you even treat people that are of a different culture than you, and what do you have to be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
I guess though, as discussed in the reading, not mentioning race in the room is also a form of avoidance and a form of bias. Sometimes we do need to acknowledge that there is a racial difference, and as you said, like there's a connotation of years of history, right? Of dynamics that are much bigger than just this dyad that's happening in the room. There's a history that might bring pain, right? But acknowledging that in the room, there might be some beauty in this mutual healing. But I think that's very difficult and brave, because it's very humble to say that you don't know a lot about a culture, or that you notice that like there is this difference playing out. So, I mean, has that ever happened to you, that you've sat with someone that you feel like this has to be addressed when we start?
So two parts to that question. When I started at USC, when I went to USC for graduate school, and I was chosen to be the Latino spokesperson, and which was very nice, but also inappropriate and unnecessary. And most of my time at USC, I remember defending myself and trying to educate and explain that Latinos, or Latinx, like the new term, that we are a vast group of people that are quite different. We come in different colors, different flavors, different language. We all speak Spanish, but we have different differences in the language, or how the language is spoken. Mm-hmm. And that there are glaring differences in terms of class, which is a historical perspective that unless you lived in Latin America, you probably won't know. So people will always lump us together and assume we're the same. Mm-hmm. And part of what I used to do was to say, well, we're not. And even my brothers from Mexico are not like my brothers from Central America, right? So I will spend a lot of time sort of defending and educating more than anything that we share a cultural thread. We share this lovely language that I love. We share a history together, but sometimes our differences are vast. So even there are differences between us, especially the issue of class, but I think that's a totally different topic. But to answer your question about has my experience with having race in the room, because I have a very noticeable accent when I speak. I was so aware and cognizant of that. It doesn't take away of who I am, but it was always in the back of my mind when I introduced myself, my last name, and I knew that I needed to always bring it to the forefront. So for a lot of people, it's sort of taken for granted, but for me, it's always the first thing I say. How do you feel about my accent? Because the assumption behind it is I don't speak English. How do you feel about being from a different country? I am not from here. I came to this country when I was 15. I say it immediately, especially because I've been doing this for so long. I work with people from all over the world. I mean, after all, this is LA, right? People who speak multiple languages and look very different from each other. So I always, that invisibility was never present for me. It was always there. And the last thing I wanted to speak on that is that I think it's empowering. See, I think to me, that difference brings so much to the table. I mean, social workers sound like psychologists, and you are a psychologist, and I am a social worker. There's this big mantra that social workers live by, that you need to start with the client is. There's this big thing that it gets hammered into your head when you start practicing. And that is beyond their symptomatology or the pathology or what kind of treatment I'm going to do, but it has to do also with who they are. And not being afraid of asking, what do you identify as? Because I have to tell you, and let you ask me another question. I don't assume people speak Spanish, because I have found that it's offensive to some folks, especially folks who have been here since Mexico. This was Mexico. I mean, and the assumption that you have a last name that is Spanish, that you will speak Spanish. I never do that. I always allow people to talk to me first. And from that point, I said, Spanish, let's do it. Because I think it's a matter of respect.
There are so many things you said that like I thought of like first, just because I mean, I don't really present looking. First, my sessions are over the phone for now, so they don't know who they're looking at. It's just a voice, an ethereal voice in space. But when I have seen people in person, I've never assumed that I'm Latina from the bat. And not only that, but my last name, Lechner, it does not sound inherently Latino. My first name is made Claudia by most people around. So when I'm introduced as Claudia, the idea of me being a Claudia doesn't really translate, because Claudia is an American name too. So when I call my patients and introduce myself and say, like, we're going to begin session in Spanish, I mean, there is like a little bit of like a hesitance, I think, like like we're going to be in Spanish with you. And it's interesting. I do have clients who are Latino and they don't want to speak Spanish. So I'm like, oh, should I, like, what does that mean? Like, does it because you're more comfortable in English? Are there some terms I can say in Spanish? It's a negotiation. I do think that when it's in English and I use some Spanish words, there is a sense of like, there's no other way I could say this, so I'm going to say it in Spanish, which is beautiful. But yes, it's funny. I've never really noticed that sometimes I do assume. Sometimes I'm like, maybe we should just go with Spanish and say speak Spanish, when I don't know. Is that what they're comfortable with? Or it's an interesting thing. I hadn't thought of that. So
I think it's an acculturation issue. Where do people feel that they fit? In the dominant culture, I'm going to go back to that. The dominant culture says, at least that narrative is also changing. It was very pervasive when I came here that if you spoke English, that's what you spoke. And I think Latinos have said always that in the past, children were not taught the language because they were ashamed of speaking Spanish. So depending where people are in that sort of acculturation curve, in the continuum. So I don't no longer assume, because I feel that I don't want them to feel that I'm judging if they either don't speak Spanish because they were never taught by their family, or because they're trying to speak English because they're now part of the American culture. So I had to navigate that. And the way I do is just, I start in English, and if they say, do you want to, is it better to speak Spanish? And I said, then I feel so much freer, because I am, and this is an interesting thing, I think I love doing therapy in Spanish because it's just so close to my heart, and I'm able to relate in this invisible, not very tangible way that I can relate to other people. Not that I'm not as effective, I think it doesn't really matter to me, but I'm able to, I think, reach a place with other folks that there's that wall sort of lift automatically, just because we come sort of from the same world.
Okay, see, and it's interesting. I have a list of questions, but also I'm glad that we're having discussion like this freely. I am not sure if I'm as effective in Spanish as I am in English as a therapist, because I feel like in English I can intellectualize and rationalize. So if I'm dealing with an emotion in English, I can be like putting the perfect phrases and navigating the affect. But I'm wondering if it's just in Spanish, I kind of just have my emotional reaction. I can't say it fancy or give a rationalization or an intellectualization of a problem. It's just like me and the emotions.
Uh-huh.
And I'm wondering, I mean, it's much more raw. So am I not doing that when I'm doing therapy in English? Like maybe, and maybe it's the opposite. Maybe I am more earnest in Spanish. Like maybe it doesn't feel therapeutic, right? But it's honest.
Okay, but I have to tell you this, and you are young and incredibly eager, and I just love to hear you speak. But I think being genuine, it's what heals.
Yeah.
And I think that is universal. The accessibility, the door that you open may be faster if you go to the affect and then go to the thinking, but the genuineness comes across to the other, and therein lies the healing. So I would even say to you that you have an extra tool in your bag of tricks with your Latinx Latino clients, because you're able to move faster in a way. You've seen that affect because it comes from a place of emotionality for you, because you related to growing up and listening to me speak to you in Spanish, listening to your father speaking Argentinian Spanish. It's part of who you are on a very emotional level.
It's funny that you say that, well, because now I'm thinking of all the times horrible things have happened, like crises. And I have this like list of things I would say in English, right? Like, how do you feel about that? Or maybe this could reflect. And in Spanish, I'm more like, I don't have time to say like, ¿cómo se siente? Like, I'm like, I should kind of just reflect, like, this is just terrible, or this is just horrible. And I don't even have the words. And I say that, I'm like, I don't have the words because I don't.
Because I think sometimes words are not that necessary. And I think as therapists, we want to interpret, we want to guide, we want to reframe, rephrase, validate. We're so willing to go through all those wonderful things that we do, but sometimes I had a case, and I won't talk about cases, but I had a case of a Vietnamese young woman who was in custody because they had taken her children away. She was so upset, and I knew the history. I mean, I knew a very little bit of the history, but she was crying so desperately. And I went to see her. She did not speak English, and I don't speak Vietnamese. And they kept asking me, well, why would you go see her? What point, what is it going to, what service would it do to her? And I said, I just want to sit next to her. And she kept sobbing and speaking to me in Vietnamese. I kept nodding. And once she settled, you really just use my hands. I put it to my heart. And she understood that I just came to accompany her. And that the gesture of trying to come and meet with her, I don't know what in her mind she thought who I was. But she was able to calm down. I think just bewildered by why is this woman just staring at me and sitting and making hand gestures. Like I would touch my heart, I would look at her and put my hands out. I mean, and I don't even know what she understood that I was doing, but I think at the end, when she was taken away, she turned around, she looked at me and waved, like almost saying, thank you. But it's all I could do.
This makes me think back to, as you know, I was in a substance abuse center for a year, which is very different than what I'm doing now, which is therapy and a more, long-term clinic kind of setting. And so often the point of substance abuse work when you're in the detox unit is kind of just to accompany in a crisis. And that was very difficult for me to learn because, there were so many intense emotions. I had this horrible anger. I remember sitting with a young man who just yelled at me for like 30 minutes. And there was nothing I was saying or doing. He was just, at the end, I turned and I was like, you're not mad at me, you're mad at yourself. And I'm just sitting here bearing it. And I wonder, like, is this all that we do? Do we just, I mean, we do many things, right? Interventions and tools and skills, but like at the end of the day, is what was meaningful actually just the connection of sitting with someone through a terrible time? Who doesn't want that, right?
Right. How powerful what you just did was, though. I mean,
It didn't feel powerful, I think.
But see, there's power in bearing witness to his pain, to his rage, to be able to tolerate the emotion.
I think that's why this job is so hard.
It is. Here's this young woman with someone who's falling apart, bearing witness to this tremendous amount of pain and taking it. But the fact that you stood there and took it and not run away and was able to contain the affect for a while, that in itself, I think, is healing.
And then in a way, it's like then the culture, it's funny because in some ways culture matters so much. And then in some ways it's just being there. And in some ways, I mean, it's very difficult. It's almost like you have to be aware of culture in the room, but also be aware that sometimes there are going to be things that happen that are beyond that.
Exactly. But I think social justice begins with presence.
Well, just the fact that you want to be there.
Exactly. Social justice begins with presence. Empowering others begins with presence. Being self-aware of your shortcomings and your lack of complete understanding of the other is empowering. The fact that you're humble enough to say, I don't know your history. Tell me your history. Can you tell me your history? I will never know what it is like to walk outside and have dark skin, but I can tell you, I know what it is like to walk outside and have some light skin, but most people say that I have dark skin, and I know how people look at me because of my skin color or my hair. But I wouldn't know anybody else's experience because that is somewhat subjective, right? And I think what is empowering is that we don't need to know all the details of that experience. What we need to know is what that experience means to them. And that is what social justice is in my eyes.
Yeah. I think that's a great transition to feminism because I mean, feminism is such an interesting movement. It's been defined because it is so subjective in so many ways. Beginning with its origins in a very white feminism, right? That then seemed to define a movement that has now kind of been an attempt to be reclaimed by people of color, by queer voices, by transgender rights. I'm wondering, like, how do you define feminism?
I think being a woman from a country where women's rights were so trampled with, I was always aware of the long road ahead of us as women. And I think understanding the cultural norms that I come from, what moved people around me, and how women had to fight for the basics. In my country, having an abortion still illegal until recently. I mean, a basic human rights. I mean, feminist movement began with the desire to to vote, to fight social inequity, to understand the systems of power that oppress us as women. But I think for a lot of women in the third world, we were just asking to be able to raise our children and be safe and not be raped and murdered. I mean, I don't know if you know, but the women that get murdered in Latin America, the number is outrageous. Or we are the women in Latin America are also known for being victims of domestic violence. So I think I was always aware of how far we had to go and how I rolled as individuals who come into the world have a responsibility. And I think the way I interpret that, it's on one hand by becoming a mother and teaching my children the value of human life, and second, how as a person of color in a different country, as a woman, how I could, just by being me, make a difference and begin that process of social justice. I mean, I think just my presence as a clinician speaks volumes of how far we come, but we still have an enormous way to go.
I think I have a hard time reconciling some of the ways in which the feminist goals of like the first world and the feminist goals of the third world.
Right.
Because I mean, there are some basic human rights lacking, and not like we're going to do a hierarchy of power, like who is struggling worse as a woman in this world. But I mean, I have clients who it's like their lives are consumed by their role as a woman, right? Clients who married young because in Mexico there was really no other option for them to escape poverty, right? And who had 8 children because that's just what you did. And you're not going to start by talking about like feminist rights to this client. Like that's just not going to work or translate. So it's like, how do you empower your clients when they also aren't necessarily sure that like what that would look like for them? That's what's hard for me when I work with this population. How a win for them is like, I can be a stay-at-home mom and not be hit every single day, right?
The hierarchy of needs for those folks is very different of what you will envision as their hierarchy of needs are. And I think you'll find as you go on doing this work that we navigate a very difficult line of what they perceive, what someone perceives as an injustice, to what we perceive as an injustice. And what my rule of thumb, the way I have come to consider that issue of that provocative questioning, how do I reconcile, how have I come to peace with that, is I explore and explore, and I ask myself, whose agenda is this? Is it my agenda? If and that's very difficult to hear, because maybe in your personal life you will say, I will never have tolerated this. How can this be possible? How can this person not see it? It's speaking in front of them. So I explore and I do this philosophical question sometimes, well, I know this is all you know, but maybe there's a different way. Being very respectful of what they attribute as their needs, and not necessarily my interpretations of what their needs are. And I think that self-awareness, as a therapist, you're trained so much. What are the issues that you bring into the table? What are the contradictions that you feel when you see this patient, this client? What is it bringing up inside me? I think the more you are so self-aware of where is this person hitting me inside, that's what will empower you to do this work the best way you can.
I'm thinking of, I had a professor tell me like a few weeks ago when I described a situation with a client in class, she said, it sounds like you aren't willing to get on her bus and let you drive her. You're in the bus of her bus. You're not like driving the bus and you're picking her up. And I think philosophically, I don't view therapy in that way. I don't view it like I'm on someone's bus. I'm driving my bus and they're coming on for this little stop for an hour and then I drop them off. It's like too much control to give up. I don't want to be on someone else's bus, especially if that bus disagrees fundamentally with me, right? But maybe that's my thing to work on, which is like, this is not my agenda, and I'm not right.
Well, whose bus is it though? I mean, I think that's the question, right?
Can we share?
Can we share the driving?
Yeah, how about like half and half? I think therapy should be half and half.
But I don't fully agree with that. See, I think
neither did my professor.
I think the best way I have come to terms with what truly my role in this, when I think of my transference, my countertransference, and I keep asking myself, what is it that I'm feeling? Why do I come out of this session and I just want to run away or, run in the street naked? I mean, what is it that I came out with? What is that? And the more I feel that, the more I keep asking myself, my job, and this is something I think it's not spoken quite often in therapy, because we're given all these ideas of what we're supposed to be or do. And I have come to peace with myself. And I think that just reflects how old I am and how long I've been doing this. No, I'm serious. That I'm just an agent of change. Not much may happen with this exchange, be it twice that I see you or a year that I see you. And I must empower you along the way, even if that empowering doesn't necessarily is congruent to what I see that life should be. What is my job?
That makes me think of, which I've had it happen many times, where clients are in domestic violence relationships, right? And then they come back to me the day after something's happened, or like something has happened. They're like, oh no, like we're not going to do this again. Like this is the last straw. And then 2 weeks later, it's like, well, like they've returned back to that relationship. I don't think that's something that triggers a huge emotional reaction with me. Like I'm okay with sitting with them as they decide to navigate this relationship.
Right.
But then there's always this little bit of me that thinks like, is this not feminist of me? Like, shouldn't I be saying like, leave this relationship, let's get the resources, let me come pick you up, and we'll take you out, and like you'll be safe, and why are you still doing this? Instead, I'm exploring objectively, like, why do you go back? And it's hard to do that, to just sit back when I'm so strongly believing in like, let me save you.
Right.
But maybe that's youth, right?
That is youth. And I would be very happy to have that youth in not that I want to be as young as you are now, but I think be grateful that you have that youth and that stamina, that passion, that desire to change, because we all need to start. I remember when I was at that and I started, I will feel the same way. indignant. What do you mean you're going back? What's happening? What do you mean? But I saw the black and blue marks. Why are you going back to the same situation? But as I gotten older, I think what's more important is the fact that change comes in very small doses. And that the best thing you can do as a feminist therapist is to understand our sisters in the world, that we are all in very different places in our lives. And that what we have in common is this desire to help one another.
I don't know how this turned very philosophical, but I think for a long time we are taught as therapists that, I don't know if it's like unspoken, but you're supposed to be doing these huge strides of change. You're supposed to be fixing the problem. And I think goals like that are so formulaic assist and enable this belief that this needs to be done, like depression needs to be over, anxiety needs to be done, stress, post-traumatic stress should be managed by a certain time. And I understand the insurance purpose of that.
Right.
But in reality, I think now very rarely do you see huge change that you have done in a therapy session. I don't know if that exists.
I don't think the sea parting visions come. I think we have the expectations that we are going to see immediate, but I think that speaks more, and I'm going to go philosophical again, and I'm sorry. I think that speaks a little bit more about the culture we live in, immediate gratification. Diets, you have to drop 25 pounds for the diet to have been effective. That we want things to be fixed now.
Immediate results.
Immediate results. And if immediate results do not happen, you're inherently a failure.
Yes. Yes, you are.
So I think if we come and readjust what the goals are, not for insurance purposes, because we know as clinicians that I always found them to be so silly in the sense that you have to numerically say, well, it's going to go from 10 to 5 by this day. That's like, how did you put math in there? But that's another, this is another way we're going to change the patriarchy. But no, I think if we think of change on a continuum, and we recognize that sometimes change happens only gradually, that then we are be willing to look more optimistically that most people overall, and this is the optimist in me, want to do better. Not immediately, they're not going to not be depressed. They're not going to not go into another manic phase, but things will happen enough. I used to tell my clients who are very chronically ill that, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. We're going for the long haul here. The voices will always come.
Yeah.
Our job is, well, what are we going to do with them? When they come really, really loud and very, very often, what do we do? Not that they're going to go away and one day you're going to wake up and not have schizophrenia. It is not going to happen. But how we handle it, the attitude we take towards that, the steps we take to prevent a complete crisis or going into the hospital, that we have a lot of steps to work with, a lot of latitude, a lot of space.
It's funny you say that because yesterday I was negotiating that. I've had a client who has a very persistent depression and very persistent anxiety. And I think I reached a point where I said, like, I don't know if this is something that like 10 sessions more is going to take away. I said, like, I'm sorry, but if I could, I would. But also, it seems like you just need to manage how you want to live like this. And from my sense, you don't really want to live with this like in a like more healthy way. You want to more in your mental health, which is fine. And I think that was very hard to say. Like, I can't make this better. I can help you negotiate it, but I can't take it away. And I even self-disclose, I can't take my own mental health away. I mean, I had to learn how to live with it. I think that's where it's tricky, because we're so it's ingrained in therapists and training, like, you can do this, you can take it away, you can cure. And it's like, no, in reality, if we have those standards, we're all going to be failures.
Exactly. And I think it's coming to terms with, in terms of how much you can do, what is realistically an appraisal of what you can do, and as small and insignificant the step that you give in this client, for example, seem, you'll be surprised how something so small can make such difference in someone's life. I mean, I think we need to, as clinicians, constantly reappraise what exactly is that I'm trying to do here. And that, unfortunately, it doesn't get spoken a lot in our field. What is it? Why is it that we come with this incredible expectation on ourselves? And I think that's partly one of the reasons people burn out. Because we put the responsibility of somebody's health in our hands. All we do is we contribute to them trying to get better. At the end of the day, it is their decision. And it's something that needs to be respected at the end of the day.
I mean, as you say this, I think of, working in addiction. When your client has just, been sober and their treatment is in your hands, and if they relapse or if they do pass away, there is that, ultimately this is their choice. Their sobriety is their choice. And I had a buddy at Tarzana who, every time one of our clients would relapse or if pass away, we'd always have these moments of truth where we'd say, like, what could I have done? And we've both had to say to each other the same thing, which is, there is nothing. How difficult and how humbling it is to lose someone when you tried your best and it still necessarily wasn't, it was still their decision.
It's humbling,
right?
And I think it has to come from a place of grace and a place of gratitude. That short of a time that they had, part of that was spent with you. That you have to be grateful that you were able to do that for them. How small it seems to you or insignificant, you have no idea of how insignificant it was to them. We must remind ourselves that how much we impact people, we don't know. I have people tell me years later, remember when you told me, and I can't believe that. It's so scary. And then I just sort of smiled and said, I did. I'm sure I said that. You told me once, this is about 5 years ago. And then I think, to me, it didn't seem that important at the time I said it, but I think it made sense to them then. And that was what's important, right? That vehicle of change that we can become.
My current supervisor, I think when we began working together, could sense that I was very burnt out. And he said to me, and tried to I would say beat it over my head constantly, that change is not always something you see. And she said, sometimes we don't actually get to see flowers bloom. We can only plant seeds and hope. And I think after months of hearing that, I finally began to see that is so true. Even if we want to see flowers all the time, they're rare, right? And that's the hardest part of this job, I think, for me. I don't know if that will change if it's changed for you, but
I think my expectations changed so many years ago. And I'm just happy I'm able to still see my clients and not feel burned out. And I'm just happy that I can be part of a journey, however small that journey may be. There are cases that I work for many, many months. I have cases that I have worked for years, and cases that I only see someone once, and I just make sure somebody gets enough water for that day. That's all I did for that person. But I think in my, how do I live with myself with that? I tend to come from a place of abundance. And what do I mean by that? That what I have to give is infinite, in the sense of my eagerness and willingness to help. Can that reproduce in the future, hopefully, like those little seeds that you speak of with flowers. And it's not necessary or important to me. And I think this is the key, to see the flowers bloom. My job was just to show up, and I did my best. And if flowers bloom, my God, I missed the garden. That I wish I would have seen it, but it wasn't meant for that to happen. But I have to say something to you as a clinician. I think you are exactly where you're supposed to be. It is that drive and that passion for the work we do that makes us exceptional for what we do. And I see in you this desire to be that agent of change for the future. And I think you're going to go on and do great things, because it is that inability to settle for less that will fuel you. That little rocket for you is going to take you for years, just like the rockets go out in space and they go for years and years. That desire to change the status quo, that feminist fire that burns in you, will keep burning for years to come. You're just going to have to adjust your expectations so what will be able to happen.
Yeah, and I think, thank you for saying that. It means a lot to me. I think I struggled with this initial disappointment of like a child who like realizes that Disneyland is like fake. It's the only, or like that Santa's not real, you know? Like when I went into this field, I had all these expectations. And I think very quickly early on, I'll say a higher power, because I believe in that, or a guiding light showed me through my first training experience, which was very difficult, but very like rewarding, that like, this is not what you're supposed to do. It's not going to be that you see all these flowers all the time. It's that it's going to take time. But I had to learn that lesson early, I think. And what a better time to learn it than your first time giving therapy, because then it sets the precedent for like, how can I do this and maintain myself healthily? I think you've seen more than anyone how it's been managed both healthily and unhealthily, right? I mean, I think you've seen that doing this work can cause a lot of senses of inadequacy or failure, but most clinicians don't have therapist mothers. So I know that some of my peers, for example, have these struggles and they don't have like the wisdom of somebody who's done it before survive it. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because we need to normalize that.
But I think you were in a very difficult position that you had one of your clients die so early on in your profession. It happened to me, not as early as it happened to you. And I think that death, that loss makes you question, how capable can I be? How effective am I? Can I really do this work and not lose people along the way? And that comes from that fuel, that fire that you have within you that goes and does great things in the future. That's going to keep you going for many and many years. Unfortunately, you failed to see that what you did, it was what was necessary at the time, that you did enough, but in your mind, it wasn't enough. And I think that comes from experience in dropping the expectations that we spoke about a minute ago, that we are supposed to fix things, that we're fixers. And we're not here to fix anyone. We're here to provide opportunities. We are examples of what social change is. Remember, if we see the humanity in others, we see it in ourselves. We are all one, the Buddha said, right? That once we see the humanity in each and every one of us, we're saving ourselves in essence. I think it's part of this desire of us in some ways coming to terms with our own death. How we are also going to die one day, and we can't prevent, we have no control of that death.
That makes me think that sometimes when we infuse hope in other people, we are also fueling ourselves. right? And we feel like when our clients are doing better, they gives us like that optimism, especially if you're a therapist with a mental health disorder, especially if you're a therapist who is a client or a patient to someone else. You begin to feel like there is this parallel processing that is also not talked about. I think there are so many clinicians who also struggle with mental health, but it's so shamed and not discussed that it kind of, we go under the rug. It would be great if one day there is a field dedicated to, you know, support for therapists who have mental health disorders without this being this thing, right? That we're so afraid to share or disclose, not to clients in some cases, maybe appropriate, but to each other.
And I think this is why talks like this that you're doing are so critical for the field. And if you look at your classes, and I know part of your cohort is going to see this interview, if you look at your classes, people don't go where we've been this hour. It's too frightening to speak about our enormous limitations as a human being, to come to face with death day in and day out, to come to terms with how much can we really do in the world, and how we dedicated our profession to do something that sometimes you're not going to see the results of it, and how you lose the locus of control, you know, how that makes us feel,
Yeah.
how barren we feel, how helpless, the feeling of I can't do anything, that powerlessness that often our clients inhabit becomes ours. So many times I come to tears with my clients to well. And I don't even know why I cry so much when I see them getting better with little, and I don't mean big gains. I mean tiny little gains. When one of my clients says, you know, I took the bus and nobody laughed at me because I was singing and people thought I was singing instead of listening to my voices. And I just feel like crying. You did it. You see, you can take a bus and then you can do it again. And what a great gain that was. Well, it's so little, but that's the day. That's what fuels your days, I think. And that's why I've never stopped doing direct contact with people, because it just keeps me going.
I mean, I write in I applied to a new practicum, and I would write in my letters, you know, you have to talk about your experiences in the past. And I think I always say, like, having worked with severe mental health for 2 years, a year and a half now, I can say that I have found more life affirming and more death affirming things at the same time, which is very odd. Really, truly a like Eros and Thanatos in this field that is like more than I've ever had in my life. Both good and bad, having to hold both good and bad. And then maybe that's the lesson for me in this world.
That we would be willing to inhabit the duality of being alive, right?
Duality.
The only way to come to terms with so much love and happiness is to come to terms with so much desolation and pain. They are not separate from one another.
No.
And we need to be able to face death with them.
Because it's the most human act of all.
Exactly. And I think that makes us sort of in the same kind of place where priests are, where people who spend their lives bearing witness, where a neurosurgeon walks into a room and he knows he's going to open up your brain and prays, may God just guide me so I can do this a good way. I mean, I think people entrust their lives in your hand and you think, oh my God, I hope I do the right thing for this person. It's no different than that.
I mean, this was so, I feel like we could talk forever. But I also love this, and it was so beautiful, and I'm so grateful that you are here and did this with me. So thank you.
Well, I am so grateful too. And this is a call to action, you know, this was a feminist conversation and we went in different tangents. It's a call to action from me to you to write, to put in paper your experiences. It is to people, through people like you, exploring, having the courage to go where other clinicians may not go because of their own issues or because of the stigma. It's a call to action for you to do things differently, and to write for the future clinicians, for the young generation of other people like you who have the desire to help the world. Yes,
Thank you.
it's
Thank
a
you.
pleasure, Claudia.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.